Hi guys, and welcome to another Brown Car Guy Bulletin. And being that this is a Black History Month in the UK, although personally I think that black, and for that matter brown, and essentially also the other side of British imperial history should really just become a part of the national history curriculum, don't you think so, rather than being a separate month? Anyway, being that there is such a thing as Black History Month and we're in it, I thought I'd look at black car history. The trouble is, you do have to go digging to find it, and it's perhaps more contemporary than historical. However, there are some significant events and people right back to the earliest days of mass motoring that we need to talk about. But before we do that, make sure that you are subscribing to youtube.com/browncarguy. Make sure you follow me on all the social media channels. Just search for my hashtag browncarguy on Instagram, Twitter and Facebook, and of course subscribe to browncarguy.com. You can also support me and sponsor my content on patreon.com/Shazad Sheikh. More about that later on. Right, let's get into this. So who are your automotive heroes? Enzo Ferrari, Henry Ford, Colin Chapman, maybe even Bertha Benz. Look her up if you don't know her. It's an amazing story. Maybe we'll talk about that in another video. All of those people are incredible, but where are the black automotive heroes, or the brown ones for that matter? But you know what? Let's park that for another time. This is, after all, Black History Month. And whilst no black automotive heroes might immediately come to mind, except obviously for Lewis Hamilton in terms of the contemporary world of motor racing, more on him later, there are some other extraordinary people that you do need to be aware of. And let's start with Frederick Douglass Patterson, born 1871 and died 1932. Believe it or not, this chap was a contemporary, and dare I say even a rival of no less than Henry Ford. Not only does Patterson have the distinction of being the first African American to play in the Ohio State University football team in 1891, but when he returned to his dad's carriage making business, he proceeded to turn it into a car company. Yep, he made the Greenfield-Patterson automobile of 1915. In fact, he made 150 of them. The cars competed directly with the Ford Model T and even sold for about the same price, about $850. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to get financing for expansion, and not being able to compete with the big guys, in 1920 he moved on to making buses and trucks on Ford and GM chassis, and the Greenfield Bus Body Company continued to operate till 1939. Imagine if he'd been able to expand. What would he have been now? Sadly, none of his cars exist anymore, but someone, I think, should at least build a replica in his honor. Come on, that's the least we can do. Now, you could argue that Patterson was the first African-American car designer too. I'd wager he was also the first black guy to set up car manufacturing in the world. And if you know otherwise, I'd love to be corrected on that. But there is another man dubbed the first African-American car designer, and that's Mckinley Thompson Jr. Born in 1922 and died in 2006, he grew up in Queens, New York, and remembers seeing a silver grey DeSoto Airflow when he was 12 years old. He said he was never so impressed with anything in his life, of course a short life at that point, but anyway, he knew in that moment that he wanted to be a car designer. Having served in World War II as an engineer in the early 50s, he entered a design contest in Motor Trend magazine. And he came up with a turbine car with a plastic body, and he won. That led him to enroll at the College of Design under a Ford scholarship scheme. You know, there's a new Ford Bronco out at the moment, right? Well, Mckinley Thompson, was one of the designers of the original car. He also worked on a truck, the early 1960s Thunderbird, and even some of the concepts for the Mustang and the GT40. In his spare time, he went back to his original design concept idea of a plastic-bodied car and created the Warrior concept. It was intended as a cheap and versatile vehicle for Africa and developing countries. The vehicle still exists and is part of Ford's collection. It never went into full production, sadly, but that's not to take anything away from Mckinley's incredible achievements. But Talking of concept cars, how about this as the first supercar by a black car designer, the Ikinga Gt mid-engined rear-wheel drive Chevrolet V8 powered supercar with a ZF 5-speed manual, and it was based on a McLaren M1B platform. One running car was actually built and it was restyled 3 times and became the Mark 1, 2 and 3. It was designed by David Gitten, who was also a star photographer on Car and Driver magazine in America from 1958 until 1964, when he married and moved to England. 3 years later, he started designing vehicles including a gas-powered single-seat city car, an electric city car, a 3-wheeler, an expandable 6-wheeler, and of course this supercar, which was made right here in the UK. What does Ikenga mean? It's a spirit often represented by a horn statue in Gitten's ancestral Igbo culture in Nigeria. I hope I pronounced that right. It represents human achievement, accomplishment, and success. Sadly, this supercar didn't go into full production, so not quite successful, despite being showcased at Earl's Court, the motor show, in 1968, and in Harrods as well. 100 or so cars were planned with prices up to $17,000, but only one was made and apparently was sold at auction in 2008. It's somewhere in the Middle East, but no one quite knows where. Now, David Gittens is desperate to find it, so if you have any information about it, let me know. I can tell him because I will be doing a video interview with him very soon. So stand by, make sure that you're subscribing and that you've hit that notification button so you don't miss any of my videos, especially not that one. Of course, there's been a few black car designers since. We've got Ralph Gilles, who's the head of design at Fiat Chrysler Automobiles, and Oliver Helmer, who is head of design at Mini. But the highest ranking black person in the car industry is, of course, Edward Welbon, who was General Motors' vice president of global design from 2003 to 2016, following in the footsteps of people like American car design legend Harley Earl. Welbon oversaw the development of cars like the Chevrolet Camaro, Corvette, and the Cadillac Escalade. His is a great story. He fell in love with cars when he was just 8 years old after seeing a Cadillac concept car at the Philadelphia Auto Show, and wrote to GM aged 11 stating that he wanted to be a car designer. The company actually wrote back to him with advice on how to fulfill his dream, what he should be doing. And in 1971 he got an internship at the car giant. The following year he joined GM full-time and ended up working there for 44 years until his retirement. Anyway, we seem to have wandered back into the contemporary times, and this is supposed to be about black history. Although it could be justifiably argued that all these guys are making history and are still making history in their own way. Still, let's go back to the early days of motoring, to 1930s America. An emerging African American middle class were buying cars, but this was still the era of the Jim Crow laws, and legally sanctioned segregation and discrimination was rife. In fact, black people were partly buying cars to avoid the indignity and insult of segregation on public transport. Unfortunately, things weren't hugely better on the road. Driving across the expanse of America, black people could face dangers and problems such as refusal to sell them food or fuel, being harassed or attacked, and even randomly arrested for no real reason. So New York mailman Victor Hugo Green took it upon himself to write a book that would help those travelers, initially covering the New York area, but eventually most of North America. The Negro Motorist Green Book, more commonly just called the Green Book, of 1936 became an absolute invaluable resource, telling you what places to avoid, where you'd be accepted, and where you could eat or stay along the way. Little known outside of the black community, it's been described as a sort of parallel universe and the black travel Bible during the Jim Crow era, which is all kind of wonderful, but at the same time tremendously sad and rather appalling. Thankfully, shortly after the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which banned such discrimination, the Green Book was no longer needed and went out of publication. You know what? Every petrolhead who hasn't already done so dreams of going to America and doing the fabled Route 66. And I've got to confess, it's on my bucket list too. But now I'm thinking, how cool would it be to retrace some of the Green Book routes? Have any of you ever done that? If you have, let me know. I'd be fascinated to hear about that. Of course, for most of us guys, as soon as you start driving, you start to get the itch to race. Unfortunately, you've guessed it, black people were pretty much banned from taking part in mainstream motorsport events too back in the day in America. Which is why one Charlie Wiggins never fulfilled his dream to race in the Indianapolis 500, though it didn't stop him racing, I've got to add. Wiggins was born in 1897 and died in 1979. He went from a shoeshine boy in front of a garage to working there as one of the mechanics to ending up a chief mechanic in World War I. After the war in 1922, he moved to Indianapolis, opened his own garage, and built his own race car from salvaged junkyard parts. But he was barred from taking part in the Indy 500 because he was black. So instead, teaming up with others, he created the Gold and Glory Sweepstakes, a black-only 100-mile race over a 1-mile dirt track at Indiana State Fairgrounds. 12,000 people attended the first race in 1924, and he won 3 championships until sadly he lost his leg in a crash at the 1936 race. He didn't quite retire though, making himself a prosthetic leg. He continued to build race cars for the next 40 years and didn't give up his campaign to see a black person race at Indianapolis. And in fact, he would get to see that. Because in 1949, World War II veteran and car mechanic Wendell Scott, then aged 30, was caught running moonshine, illegally produced alcohol. Now, that apparent misfortune would prove something of a turning point in black motor racing history. Of course, running moonshine, as some of you will know, is part of the origin story of stock car racing in America. So anyway, unable to race officially, he used to attend local stock car races and spectate from the blacks only section of the stands. In 1952, the organizers decided, as something of a gimmick, to recruit a black driver for a one-time race. Funnily enough, they asked the police to recommend someone, and they named Wendell Scott. They obviously had a few run-ins with him by that time. Of course, he did rather well and continued stock car racing and eventually became the first licensed African-American NASCAR driver racing in the top division from 1961 to the early 70s. They even made a movie about him starring Richard Pryor. It was in 1977. It was called Greased Lightning. I've got to go find it. I've never seen it. Have you seen it? Let me know what it's like. Anyway, people like him paved the way for the likes of Bubba Wallace, who races in NASCAR Cup Series today and is regarded as the most successful African-American driver in the history of NASCAR. Although, let's not forget William Theodore Ribbs Jr., or Willie T. Ribbs, who is the first black driver to qualify for Indy 500 in 1991, who also competed in Trans Am Series, in the Champ Car, in NASCAR, in the Truck Series, and was the first black person ever to test a Formula One car in 1986 with the Brabham team. Now age 65, he's still known to occasionally put on a race suit and helmet. Ribbs never actually raced an F1 car though, and bringing this monologue right back up to the present, the strange reality is that Lewis Hamilton is the only black person to have ever raced in F1, and boy, he certainly showed everybody how it's done. With 6 F1 World Championships and probably picking up his 7th this year, I've got no doubt about it, Hamilton is not only Britain's most successful racing driver, Sir Jackie Stewart is next with 3 championships, but also on the verge of equaling Michael Schumacher's championships and surpassing his 91 race wins, having already achieved a record 95 pole positions. That's Hamilton himself. And yet, after 13 years in F1, he's still the only black guy to have raced at what is often regarded as the pinnacle of motorsports. I mean, come on, we've even had a couple of brown guys, brown car guys, as you say, Gaurav Chunduk and Narayan Karthikeyan in Formula One. But what about other motorsports? Where are the black and brown racing heroes? Anyway, we've gone full circle, and to conclude this, the point is that there are some remarkable black people in the world of cars, past and present, and hopefully future as well. But frankly, not enough is made of that, and that needs to change. Meanwhile, do let me know if I've missed something else significant. I want to hear about it. Otherwise, I do hope that you found this as fascinating as I did when I was researching it. And if you did, then please make sure that you're subscribing to youtube.com/ Brown Car Guy. Make sure you're following me on all the social media. Just search for my hashtag Brown Car Guy on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. And of course, subscribe to browncarguy.com. If you enjoy my content, then hey, why not sponsor it? And you can do that at patreon.com/Shazad Sheikh. And a big shout out and thanks to people who have done so. That's Muhammad Ali Umaid in the UAE, Partha over in India, find him on parthans.com, Tom Conway Gordon here in the UK, and Isaac in America, find him at bespokeautos.com. Thanks so much to you guys. You guys are awesome. Perhaps you can join that list. If not, don't worry. Please continue to press like, to comment, to share, to subscribe, all the rest of it. That's really appreciated. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you all again in the next video.